A raging pandemic for 3 times, wave after wave, for over 5 long years. People stuck in home, medical services failing, and a young boy growing up to witness the mass destruction that destroyed the population of Europe by 1/3. This young boy will be growing up to fight for his nation, go on expeditions across the continent, and become so gigantic a figure that a whole age will be known after him. Hello and welcome back to NibblePop. Today in this video, which is a part of the video series on the history of English literature, we are going to look at the Chaucerian age, or the age which comes right after the Anglo-Norman period. Subscribe to this channel because these video lectures will help you not just get good marks in your undergraduate and postgraduate exams, but also help you crack competitive exams like NET and SET. Watch till the end of this video because I am not just going to talk about Chaucer, but about this whole age, its political, historical, and literary background with you. The period between 1350 and 1400 is known as the Age of Chaucer. Let's first look at the historical context of the age. 3 key events must be remembered. Number 1, the 100 Years' War. Number 2, Black Death. And 3, the Peasants' Revolt. Now, interestingly, in our discussion, we will see how these 3 are actually intimately connected. Now, we have discussed that the Normans were people from France and William the Conqueror, he was from Normandy. Now, this 100 Years' War, this was basically a war that England fought against France. A little bit of history will help us understand why this event started. Edward II, yes, you've guessed right, the same Edward II on whom Christopher Marlowe wrote his play. Edward II was a failure of a ruler. When he came to throne after his father's death, he saw that the treasury was not up to his expectation. Okay, he didn't have much money in his treasury. But he lacked the economic insight to actually do something about it. And that enraged his nobles because he was failing to give his country any kind of economic stability. Moreover, Edward II, he had a favorite nobleman, and that person was called Gaveston. He was also from France. He promoted Gaveston to the rank of a noble and gave him a lot of resources. In fact, as we see in Marlowe's play, he gave not only his attention but his affection as well to him, so much that his wife felt insecure about their relationship. Over time, it was seen that the nobles were getting totally against the king. They ended up killing Gaveston, and that enraged the king even further. Eventually, Mortimer, one of the noblemen, he got into an affair with Queen Isabella, and they plotted against Edward II. Isabella, she was from France, she got help from French king, and they attacked Edward, captured him, imprisoned him, and eventually murdered him. After this, Mortimer and Isabella started ruling, but that rule did not last long because Edward's son, also named Edward, Edward III, he claimed back his throne, executed Mortimer, and sent his mother to prison. Now, after Edward III became the king, obviously he bore a grudge against the French king or the French royalty. Edward III wanted to be a powerful king, but the French king at that time, he started to demand feudal duties from Edward III for his properties in France. Now, Edward III said, why would I do something like that? Why would I give you taxes? And he decided to move on to war. This war started, and this was to last for almost over 100 years with a little bit of interruptions now and then. And this came to be known as the 100 Years' War. In some of the battles, the Englishmen, they won, and often they used the technique of the longbow, or the longbow method. Now, just after this 100 Years' War started, the country was struck with the worst natural calamity that it had seen till then. And not just England, it was the whole of Europe. This disease was the bubonic plague, and it spread through these fleas or small insects that lived on the furs of rats. And these rats, they entered England in ships which went for trading, or more importantly, for naval warfare against France. Because when this 100 Years' War started, a lot of ships carried soldiers across the channel and came back infested with rats, infected with the diseased fleas. This disease spread like wildfire. When people died, their bodies turned black. This death came to be known as Black Death. It was also called Black Death perhaps because in the European psyche, the word black is always associated, which is a very racist thing too, with evil, with horror. Now, this Black Death touched everything and everywhere. The whole economy was bankrupt. You can guess that. We all have felt experiences. Now, imagine a 21st century pandemic without the 21st century medical resources. That is exactly what happened to the economy of not just England but Europe. Workshops were closed, trade guilds disintegrated, universities turned away students saying that teachers were dead now, and eventually a crisis swept across the nation, an economic crisis. And whenever an economic crisis comes, the divide between rich and poor, that divide increases. Because somehow the rich people manage to go on, to survive, to become even richer. And in these kinds of crises, the most affected people are the poorest people of a country. The divide between the rich and poor that grew so much that people started to even distrust the churches, because even the churches, they were exploiting people. The fathers of the churches, the priests, they were exploiting people. They were getting fatter and richer, while the poor peasant, he suffered. Death rate was so high that at one point there was a crisis of laborers. And when there is less number of laborers available, then the wages also increase. That led to a lot of discontent as well. Eventually, matters worsened to such an extent that the whole nation rose up in revolt. And this revolt is popularly called the Peasants' Revolt. So you see how these three important events are so intimately connected to each other. Placed in this historic context, the literature of the age gains significance. 5 writers of the age, Chaucer, Langland, Wycliffe, Gower and Mandeville, represent the beautiful variety of the age of Chaucer. It must also be remembered that this was the time when people like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio were bringing about the Italian Renaissance in the continent. Chaucer's literary career is divided into three phases or periods: the French period, the Italian period, and the English period. During the first 30 years of life, Chaucer was heavily influenced by French literature and culture. He was introduced in the court at a very young age, when he was around 17. A couple of years later, he went on to fight in that 100 Years' War. And interestingly, he also once got caught by the French army and he was ransomed by the king at a high price. Now, during this phase, he came into close contact with French language and culture, and the French language became like his native language. The best known poem of this phase is Roman of the Rose. This is a translation from Roman de la Rose, which is a French medieval allegory. Another very popular book which he wrote during this phase was the Book of the Duchess. This one was written after the death of his patron's wife. His patron was John of Gaunt and the name of his wife was Blanche. Now, I've listed some of the poems, other poems which he wrote during this phase alongside, so have a look. In around 1370, Chaucer was sent on diplomatic missions to the continent, where he travelled extensively. This was the time that spanned for about 15 years that Chaucer came under the influence of the Italian writers, and this phase is called the Italian phase. The chief work produced in this second phase, the Italian phase, is Troilus and Cresside, a poem of 8,000 lines. The source of this poem was Boccaccio's Il Filostrato, but he infuses his own ideals of society to make it have an English flavor. We also have the unfinished poem, The House of Fame. The third great poem during this period is The Legend of Good Women. Now, this was a book that was written about famous women who had been loyal and true for their love. He had planned to write a lot of legends or a lot of poems here, but he left the work, again unfinished, in the middle of the 9th legend, because now he was probably planning of something grander. That brings us to the last and the final phase in Chaucer's life and career, the English period. In the year 1386, Chaucer was elected Member of Parliament from Kent. Now, you might think that that's a lot of power, especially politically. He must have grown very rich, but that's not the real fact here. Because this was the period or the time where he saw different upheavals in his own life. There were moments when he was very poor rather, and there were moments of glory. But this was the most glorious one so far as his literary contribution is considered. It was during this time that he wrote the Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales had a grand plan. He had a plan where 30 pilgrims going to this pilgrimage of Canterbury, they were to tell each other 2 stories each while going to the pilgrimage and 2 stories while coming back. So count it up and it goes to 120 stories. And these 30 pilgrims represented different kinds of people, all kinds of people in society. So it was going to be a medley of the whole age, but he managed to write only 24 stories. He died before he could complete it. These 24 stories, they offer such a variety of expression, not just thematically, but also stylistically, that sometimes people wonder that how could one person write in so different ways? All except two are written in verse. So two stories are written in prose. What were the themes? The themes included love, chivalry, saints and legends, travels, adventures, animal fables, allegory, satire, and even coarse humor of the common people. The characters are not idealized heroes like you had in metrical romances, knights in shining armor. The characters were common people whom the common man could identify with. Chaucer gave new life to the Midland dialect, which was the native dialect of English people, and made it the tool for expressing poetry, the tool for expressing prose. And this was important because this was a time when English was officially becoming the language of the court, of the parliament, and of the schools. It's not surprising that this change from French being the official language everywhere to English being the official language everywhere, this change happened during the lifetime of Chaucer, because he was responsible to bring about this change, to make people believe that English is a capable language. Speaking of common men and women, let me take you to the year 1362, when a poor church worker, a clerk, he wrote a book not to please the rich nobility, but for common people. This man was William Langland, and the book I'm talking about is Pierce Plowman. When this book appeared in 1362, it was only 1800 lines. It got revised and expanded for the next 30 years till it became a massive 15,000 lines in the year 1395. It has two parts. First, dealing with the vision of Pierce, the plowman, and the second part, a series of visions called Do Well, Do Bet, Do Best, which means do well, do better, do best. Now remember, when we were talking about Anglo-Norman age, we saw that the Old English style of using alliteration and accents, it was replaced with the French style of rhyming. Now in Pierce Plowman, what Langland did was he extensively used accents and alliteration. So it was his way of rejecting the foreign language of the noblemen, because he was rejecting not just the language but the style. He was reviving the old English style, the alliterative style, and therefore he becomes one of the first writers of a movement that was called the alliterative revival, because this represented not just a revival of style but a revival of your own culture, your own roots. He understood that the borrowed style, the meter and the rhyme of the French, that will never voice the interests of the common man. The common man's interests can only be voiced through their native style, the style of alliteration. This is what the common man's ear identified with. Another important thing about this book is that he expresses loyalty to the church. He shows strong Christian ethos, but this book voices against the Catholic practices, the abuses of the priests, the expensive rituals which were draining the common man. So this was a kind of a clarion call for the Protestant movements that are going to eventually bring about the Reformation of England, its stand against the Catholic churches. Now, this was kind of a subtle reference, the reference to Protestantism. There's another man in whom we find a direct and a strong voice of protest against the Catholic practices. This voice belonged to the man John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe translated the Bible, the New Testament, and the Gospels. And it was under him that a fixed national standard of English prose was formed. Now, Wycliffe was directly responsible for a lot of movements so far as religion was concerned, and he was called a heretic, somebody who speaks against the church, somebody who is branded as an irreligious person, as an enemy of the church, but he never bent. It should also be noted that the version known as Wycliffe's Bible is not translated by Wycliffe totally, but by his followers. And his followers were mostly called Lollards, because they used to have this, low temperament. They were never loud-mouthed like the Catholics. They were never vociferous, but they followed the path of God in a silent way. So this was like being Puritans, following religion as a private and as a somber thing, not as something which is celebrated with big fanfare. So when you talk about Wycliffe, do remember who the Lollards were and how they were the earliest Puritans in England. Now, in the year 1356, an extraordinary book appeared, Voyage and Travail of Sir John Mandeville. Now, content-wise, this was a compilation, a mixture of travelers' tales, of travelers like Marco Polo, Odoric, and it was filled with interesting voyages and adventures. The original work was probably in French, but later it was translated into English and Latin and so on. The English version is written in the Midland dialect, and this was the official language that was gaining popularity during the times. We get to know about the name of the author from the prologue, where the author himself identifies himself as John Mandeville. But no biographical details are available because it is kind of a pseudonym perhaps, who knows, we are not sure of it. That's basically a collection of stories, and this is important not just because these were stories about faraway lands, but also because these were reflections of the society, of the ideals that existed in the contemporary society. So to get a general picture of the 14th century, how people thought, how people felt, this book becomes a key indicator, a key reference point. And that's why it has been translated into so many languages and there are so many versions of it available. The fifth writer of the age is Gower, a scholar and literary man who wrote in 3 languages, French, Latin and English. His chief English work is the Confessio Amantis, a long poem containing 112 stories. Now you can understand that these writers, they were writing not just in different kinds of styles, but were writing from different social standings as well. And therefore, in a nation which is threatened by wars, pandemics, rising revolts, we still have such a rich variety of literary works. It is surprising because, you see, we are all stuck in our homes now. We are feeling useless. You're feeling scared that your careers are going to be over. And right when you're feeling helpless, think about Geoffrey Chaucer. Think about that 7-year-old guy who didn't know if he was going to survive it, because even the king's wife had died of the Black Death. Think about that little boy, and I'm sure you will have the courage to believe that this lockdown, this pandemic, this is never the end of the world. This was worse back then, and we have people like Geoffrey Chaucer flowering out of it, ushering in the Renaissance eventually. So don't feel scared. The moment which you think are now being lost in isolation will be the moments that will redefine your future. On this optimistic note, let me leave you all with a blessing to stay happy and very safe. And if you feel good enough, then subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because I really want to stay connected with you. We will be meeting each other next week with the next chapter. This time we will be talking about the age of revival, the age right before the real Renaissance happens in England. So till then, bye from me. Thank you once again.